Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about how to build the resiliency that today's business demands. COVID has certainly changed things forever. New technologies and new ways to work are creating all sorts of new challenges. Really, we're talking about the subject of digital transformation. To discuss that, I'm joined by four major thought leaders. With me is Jonathan Feldman, CIO for the city of Asheville, North Carolina. Hello to you, Jonathan.
Hello, good to be here.
And I have been to Asheville, by the way. It's a wonderful place.
Please come again, spend lots of money. We love that.
Also with me is Paige Francis, CTO for the Alliance Support Company. Hello to you, Paige.
Hello, great to be here.
Joanna Young is an executive consultant and a former CIO. Hello to you, Joanna. Good to have you on board.
Hello, nice to be here.
And rounding out our panel is Miles Sewer, Director of Solutions Marketing at Elation and the organizer of CIO Chat, among many other things. A very busy guy. Hello to you, Miles.
Good to see you again. Joanna, do you still root for the Spartans?
I root for the Michigan State Spartans and the University of New Hampshire Wildcats. Luckily, they do not play in the same division except for ice hockey.
Go Spartans and go Wildcats is all I can say to that, you know? So I think, the last 18 months have been pretty amazing, a lot of challenges. How did COVID-19 change your worldview of resiliency? Paige, what do you see? And also, if you could give a brief sense of like, what does it mean in terms of resiliency? How are we defining the word in this sense? So I'm making you do all the hard work. You've got to define the term and see how it changed your life. So what is your sense?
Well, I think, resiliency is how you can respond to a changing environment. And if you can get back up on your feet again. And I think that as technology leaders, a lot of what we do has always been preparing for that worst case scenario. I think that it's practically my tagline, right? That I'm a catastrophist, that I go from zero to worst case scenario at all times with everything I do. And finally, right, like it paid off. And I think, what I had seen when, March 2020, when COVID reared its head for all of us, I was working in higher ed. I'm out of higher ed now, but I was in higher education. And really it was being able to respond to that immediate move to remote and how well could we be successful and continue our business in the face of this changing environment to where suddenly we were all thrust to be virtual. And higher education is one of those spaces where just historically we've underinvested in technology, and technology was the answer. And, it was in the Star Wars terms, right? Like it was the way, like technology is what was going to allow us to continue to move forward. And I think that the most resilient organizations were those that had leaders that were empowered to take charge, take the reins, and keep everyone connected, stay communicating with all of our people, because the people are at the root of all of our success, with the technology being that glue. How well could we respond? And could we keep those businesses going in the face of, what was absolutely an uncharted disaster for all of us?
I love that term, to be a catastrophist. I think maybe all of us are at some level. Miles, are you a catastrophist? And how has COVID changed your view of resiliency?
Well, I'd like to compare it to the space-time continuum, because we're on a path and we'll never go back to the old path.
Right.
It's permanently changed. And, I went to an office the other day, to Elation's office. And, I don't know if they're going to, I don't know what their plans are, but I don't know why you keep a big office anymore.
Right.
It should be a place you meet people, but why would you work there? The numbers are huge. 38% of workers are never going to return to an office setting anymore. And the rest are, demanding a new social contract of hybrid. So, I think the really thing that's been fascinating talking to these folks has been how the definition of resiliency has pivoted. I remember thinking nines at one time about what resiliency was.
Right, a very technological definition.
Well, yeah, but now it's about people. How do people work effectively? How do we make the systems work for them, and that kind of stuff? So I think we're in a different world.
Joanna, what is your take in terms of, how did COVID-19 change your worldview of resiliency?
So it changed my worldview. Those of us who have been in IT for a while, we all recall the disaster recovery planning and business continuity exercises and things like that. And certainly firms who had taken those seriously and invested time and energy in creating good ones. That helped, however, for I would say, maybe a few weeks to a month. I think that what we learned from this is that you cannot prepare for every situation. And so what you now need to do is build into your organization from a culture perspective, a process perspective, from a talent perspective, the ability to be flexible and agile and not get too locked in. I agree with what people are saying in terms of, there's a new contract with employees. And it is certainly true that there's a lot of employees who used to go to, get up in the morning and drive or fly or whatever to places. And there's a large percentage of those who will be not doing it all or doing it a lot less. But I think as technologists and as leaders, we also need to remember the, many people who don't have that sort of choice. For example, restaurant workers or retail workers or, people who drive buses. And I think that the resiliency, I have to tell you, I think the people who I admire the most are those small businesses, like in our downtown areas or whatever the case may be, who figured out how to hang on until they could, be in person again. I mean, you saw a tremendous amount of creativity. I think the most creativity, quite frankly, came from organizations with the least resources. And I think that we can learn from, we need to look to and learn from really the unexpected places about how to be, more nimble, and again, build that into our technology, our process, our talent, and our leadership.
Interesting. Jonathan, you were living in this very beautiful place. I mean, how does COVID affect your sense of resiliency in a gorgeous place like Asheville?
Well, in public safety, we never talk about resiliency. Never, ever, ever. I'm kidding, of course. And of course, we have that conversation all the time. We were talking about, believe it or not, we were talking about pandemic planning in 2009, and we were talking about it in terms of SARS. So, when the pandemic hit, we pulled out the plan and said, planning was really essential, but as Eisenhower said, this particular plan is useless, right?
Right. So,
for me, resiliency is the ability to absorb an event, right? In that public safety vein. It's the ability to respond to an event. And so emergency management framework was really helpful for us and for me personally in understanding that preparations aren't just for a point in time event. Being prepared means that you're prepared for whatever the event is, because when you prepare for a pandemic, you can bet your bottom dollar it'll be an earthquake instead, right? So prepare. The other thing that we're now seeing in this world of supply chain disruption is that perhaps lean is not necessarily the panacea that we thought it was, because lean might actually mean starving and unprepared and underprepared. And so when you have these just-in-time kinds of things, it brings to mind the Rube Goldberg, or you remember the game Mousetrap, or probably most people don't, but probably we do. Where if one little thing goes wrong, you have a big problem. So, lean is great, just-in-time is great, but I think as leaders in this, in business, in government, in not-for-profit, in education, we got to be thinking about lean is not always a great thing. Sometimes prepared is a better thing than lean.
Interesting. Listening to you talk, Jonathan, I'm reminded of two quotes. There's an old Greek saying that says, "Man plans and the gods laugh," which I've always appreciated that.
Yes.
Maybe even more to the point, Mike Tyson said, Everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. But okay, Mike, you would know about that. Let's take a look at, how is your sense of resiliency grown and developed in terms of people, and what sorts of steps are companies taking, or you personally taking, to help people, process, and technology? Miles, your take on that?
Well, I'm gonna come to Jonathan, actually, a story he told me. He told me about building inspectors.
All right.
And they always had to go to the site. But when COVID hit, they said, well, why couldn't we create an app and let the person take a picture and they could talk to the building inspector and they didn't have to physically go to the site?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I just think people have been really creative in thinking about, well, why do we do it this way? I mean, the other great story I'll tell you is that we didn't get truncation of checks in this country until 9/11, because the Fed was sending airplanes across the country with all of our checks. And they finally said, well, this is stupid. We can't even get the airplanes in the air because they've been closed down. We need to do something. So I think we're starting to ask really interesting questions. How do we need to do this job? Do we really need to do it this way?
Joanna, your sense of resiliency and the people question, what does that mean to you?
So I heard an interesting phrase lately that we need to start thinking about, or we need to shift our thinking around the traditional sort of human resources, if you will, and really think more around the lines of a talent agenda. And the social contract, as somebody said previously, has changed dramatically. And I think there's a lot of work to do on process, technology, and people, but I think people most of all. How I like to think of organizations and how I coach organizations is in terms of like a Venn diagram. There's 4 primary circles: people, process, technology, and leadership. And the capability and the capacity of your organization is only going to be as good as the lowest performing circle, right? So, and the circle, I think, where you can really take a hit with your, performance, whatever products and services that you're trying to put out there, is people. I mean, all we have to do is go out and look around and see all the hiring signs, right? You only need to go to LinkedIn and see, all the jobs are out there. You only need to see the data that there are way more jobs, for example, needing programmers than there are people coming out of higher education with relevant degrees and skills. So, what I'm telling organizations is that, before there may have been more of that focus on the technology or the process, and I believe it was Jonathan said, and building like leanness into the organization. Now I'm saying you need to pay far more attention to your talent agenda. I often use the analogy of a sports coach. Professional sports coaches in particular, they're not thinking about who they need to put in a particular position or role now. They're looking out 4 years, 5 years, a decade around how am I going to build and sustain this team so that it can be successful on the field and off the field. So I think that talent, if at the C-suite and boards, they're not having very serious discussions about how they are going to build and sustain their talent, I would be concerned for them, because no talent, no business.
Talent matters, to be sure. Paige, your sense of the people, process, and technology piece?
I just think that people, if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that people are at the center of absolutely everything we do. There was someone had mentioned disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans. As technology leaders, we've been practicing those for decades. But when you think about those plans, first of all, they were hilarious because they've got that endpoint, right? Like the worst case scenario was something lasting 90 days. And at that point, we're all laughing in our heads going, oh, well, if we're out of business for 90 days, we're just gonna have to shut the doors. Okay, so that was funny. But think about those plans and think about who was involved in the practice of those plans. not everyone felt like they were a part of that process, right?
Mhm.
They knew there were disaster recovery plans in place. There was a select amount of people that sat at the round tables and went through the practices. The furthest we ever got in including everyone were the fire drills, where everyone walked out of the building together. A few had a hard hat, and they stood outside of these buildings, and then they came back in. There was the big now what, right? Like, what happens once you get everyone out of the building? What I found rapidly is that from a technology perspective, we had rolled out and implemented most of the tools that were needed to keep everything running. We had not trained our people on how to use them and what that would look like if they were no longer in the office. So I think moving forward, even though I do see a bit of a slippery slide of people going back into the office, a little bit business as usual, we need to assume that at all times, we're going to need to pivot right back. And at the core of that being successful is people knowing how to do their jobs in a different environment, assuming there is no end to a pandemic, because that could actually happen.
Jonathan, your take? I'm kind of hearing maybe machines and software can do it all. We don't need people. What's your take? Agree, disagree with that?
No, of course I don't agree with that. I mean, the entirety of being a digital organization is about people, right? And what's interesting is that, you know, as terrible, as horrible, as tragic as COVID was, it moved us to a place where we needed to be anyway. Because I think, you know, I was writing digital tech or digital organizations put people first 10 years ago, and others were too, but executives weren't getting the memo. And you remember there was a meme circulating, what accelerated your digital transformation, CIO, CEO, CFO, or COVID-19, you know, big check mark, right? So COVID has a little bit of a silver lining in that it pushed us where we need to go anyway. And Joanna's right. There are plenty of people who cannot work remotely. That's very true of a city. Our police officers, our firefighters, water manufacturing, on and on. We're really 80% of our staff needs to be there doing their job. But for the rest, really what it's about, in my view anyway, is getting away from this industrial age Taylorism where we treat people like they're in a factory. You know, there's a whistle. I used to do earlier in my career IT turnaround. And what I found is that when organizations were at their most desperate, they were willing to let me do whatever it took, including and up to treat people like human beings. And that was always the linchpin of getting the organization turned around. It was always the linchpin of how do we get employees engaged? How do we get people to actually care? And that, my friend, is the key to high performance IT. It was 10 years ago, it was 15 years ago. But now with COVID, we're realizing that employee well-being is everything. And of course it is, and of course it always was. It just brings us to where we need to be, which is in a post-industrial digital society.
Well, on that very topic, I mean, what can IT and business do better to prepare the overall organization for being more resilient? It's definitely people. What else, Joanna? What do you say?
Well, I think, you know, there's been a lot of work done. There's a lot of work still to do on, you know, on the process and the technology piece. You know, I firmly believe in a concept called hyper acceleration, where, you know, decades ago, you could have a system, and literally that system and all its functions could support the business for years, and with, you know, not tremendous amount of change. Those days are long gone. And so the other thing that leaders need to focus on is how am I going to be setting up an organization that really needs to be continuously reinvented, not just, you know, every few years, but frankly, constantly, in order to be, you know, providing the customers the products and services that, you know, for which they will pay, you know, creating an engaged environment, to Jonathan's point, where employees want to be because they are compensated appropriately, listened to, have benefits, attention paid to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so on and so forth. So on the process and the technology part of the Venn diagram, if you will, it's the organizations that I see that are in trouble. If they had legacy debt before the pandemic, that is just a killer, because it makes there's a lot of rigidity built into the processes and the technology. For example, I recently was working with a client where the cycle time on even quite simple changes to one of their legacy systems, was weeks. Mm-hmm. And that just isn't possible anymore. So what leaders need to be doing is saying, where's the most rigid parts of our organization? Is it in a particular aspect of our technology portfolio? Is it an aspect of how we, our supply chain, a very critical area? Whatever the case may be, where are the areas that are most rigid and then are going to prevent us being flexible and agile for the inevitable next issue, pandemic, climate change, whatever the case may be. They need to get that rigidity out of their processes, their technology, their talent agenda, and frankly, their leadership.
Leadership. Miles, what do you see in terms of the IT and business piece of this?
Well, I think we're in a change moment. I mean, it was interesting, until Target happened, and then a few others, these folks were having a hard time selling cybersecurity. When I took a look at our HR systems prior to COVID, it was a hard thing to say, well, we need to invest. I mean, they got basics put in place, but it was hard to get people to invest. I think we're at a change moment right now. I think people are realizing that they need to equally invest in their people as they do in digital transformation. But I'm really looking forward to hear what Jonathan and Paige have to say here.
Paige, what would you add to that?
I think at the most basic level, as usual, IT needs to know the business. We need to be at all those tables so that we can help make sure that we can have technologies in place that are responsive and meet the needs of the whole business, right? Like that's just basic level. But in dovetailing off of what Joanna had shared, the people, right? It's the people. And now more than ever, we are all painfully aware of the fact that you get what you pay for, and you have to invest in your people. You have to pay them what they're worth. You have to pay them what will retain them. You have to invest time in their success and their ability to drive success at your business. Beyond the tech, resilience comes from the people that are engaged and dogged about being persistent about success for your business. And if you have a revolving door of people, you don't have the time nor the appropriate resources invested in these people. We have got to start paying our people what they're worth, investing in them, because they will keep businesses running. And then in all that spare time, we can figure out how to keep toilet paper on the shelves during the next pandemic, because that was a bit much for me.
I like the sound. I like the sound of that, to be sure. Jonathan, your sense of the IT and business piece?
So I think Paige covered the people thing perfectly. Here's the thing. Besides the people and focused on the business, IT has got to do a better job at communications and marketing on the inside. In other words, do people know what they've got? Paige talked a little bit about preparing prior to the pandemic. Did people know about it? Were they trained? Did they have that understanding? From a budgetary standpoint, if all IT is doing is just presenting a wish list at budget time, you can be pretty sure that if you haven't socialized it, if you haven't marketed it, if you haven't partnered within the organization, the answer is probably going to be no. And so that's so urgent, especially because of what Miles was talking about in terms of security. Because what is security? What activity drives security preparedness besides the people aspect, which is very, very critical? Modernization. How do you modernize when there's no money? But when you do modernize, all of a sudden, because like Page, City of Asheville, pushed all kinds of software and modernization. And when we really needed it, we found, oh yeah, we have end-to-end encryption already. We already have two-factor authentication, check. We didn't do that because we said, hey, we want end-to-end encryption as an add-on. We want two-factor authentication as add-on. No, we chose the most leading edge modern system. And then when we really needed it, when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden we had it. Would that happen without the money? Would that happen without the budgeting and the relationships? No, never happened.
You know, I'd like to close out our conversation by asking each of you, you know, what's important that hasn't been said? Maybe something from your own personal experience about resiliency. But what do we need to hear? Paige, what's your sense?
You know, I just think that we always need to be prepared, and I can't put an exclamation point on what Jonathan just said enough. When you focus on your modernization of systems without getting too, you know, techie, this is not about the tech. This is about knowing the business and having the right systems in place. When you keep those modern, they come with what you need baked in, as long as you're investing in those latest and greatest systems. The more modern your environment is, the more that you keep the communication going with all of your users, internal and external, the easier it's going to be to pivot when something like this happens again. And it's going to help you be more resilient in the face of anything. Are 1,000 other things going to be thrown at us? Yes. But as long as you have those basics covered, wow, what a great position to be in.
Spoken like a true catastrophist. Jonathan, your sense, what's an important thing that we do need to hear about this subject?
So we haven't talked about personal resiliency or executive resiliency, and we're talking about taking care of our staff, right? But let's talk about taking care of us, taking care of you. Do you have that personal resiliency? Are you practicing self-care? I don't care if it's yoga. I don't care if it's working out. I don't care if it's reading a book. But are you a crazy workaholic who doesn't have 5 minutes to think? Or have you slowed down a little bit? Are you financially resilient? Are you making more than you spend? All of these things are incredibly important to being able to be your best self and to have additional mind space when a catastrophe hits. So I think that's something that could even be its own webinar, right? But very important.
Personal resilience. Yeah, very important. Miles, your take, what's an important thing that needs to be said about resiliency?
Well, I mean, I think it's you know, technology is as with everything, but we didn't think this way. Technology is an enabler. I think that it's always should have been about the people, although many didn't think about that way. But I'm thinking about something that David Siddell said a week ago, which I thought was fascinating about digital transformation. He said that we need to factor in the fact that this is really hard stuff. And we need to make sure that we provide ourselves what Jonathan said. You know, we have to give ourselves some space and we don't want to be pushing through too many of these. I mean, Jeffrey Moore talks about one should go through at a time if it's a big, meaty transformational agenda. So I think we've learned the value of people and the value of protecting our own selves in this process. So I think in the end, it has been goodness, although I can't wait for it to go away.
It is far past time for it to go away. Joanna, your take, what's an important thing we need to know about resiliency?
I think that there's a concept of community resiliency, and and also community care. I think it's very important for organizations to understand what are the communities that we operate in. I mean, there's obviously the physical community, the cities or towns or geographies where we may be headquartered or have large presence. But there's also, our employee community, which can span a town or span the globe. And I think that I like what Jonathan is saying. I think that self-care needs to come first, which may sound selfish, but if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not able to care appropriately for your teams and the communities in which you operate. And then I think, after that, you have got to understand what are the communities upon which we are dependent, we're dependent on each other. And, what are the things that we need to put in place, and not just in times of crisis. Like back in March 2020, there were a lot of heroics around taking care of employee communities or local communities and things like that. But we need to really normalize this concept of, self-care and community care, employee care, so on and so forth. And I think that for me is what I'd like to really emphasize as we wrap this up, the importance of that community care.
A good note to end on. Joanna, Miles, Paige, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Pleasure to be here.